background and how you were inspired through your parents. But what initially drew you to write about the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir? And in that, how did you come to see their bond as pivotal in the American conservation history?
Great question. What drew me to it was the story of this 20-year period, 1889 to 1909. It's huge, monumental for nature conservation. And so a lot of the book, chapter 2, describes why it was so great and what happened during those 20 years. Then as part of that is who were the leaders or who took this on, and by far the great leaders of the nature conservation accomplishments during those 20 years, John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt. So background about both of them, comparing them back and forth as different characteristics. They had many things that were strong similarities. They had many things that were strong differences. Mm-hmm. And this book is a little different writing style. It has those two as major themes in different chapters, and it has some other things with chapters, the turning points in their lives, 17 naturalists or scientists that built the foundation as it moved toward the Golden Age and in the Golden Age, but wanted to also it's basically easy reading. You've got an English teacher in the midst here. So the canoe analogy is easy paddling with a few small rapids. This is not heavy. I've read a lot of books that are tough sledding. This is not tough sledding. But the reading, the style, the framework that I use is a little different. Then in telling that story, I decided to take 32 words, powerful words of naturalists, quotations, and weave those in the story. So at the beginning of a chapter, middle of a chapter, so you get a little bit of a feel. What's the Emily Dickinson great quote? There is no frigate like a book to take you far lands away. So part of those 32 quotes is to get you connected to nature, conservation, and park, wildlife refuge. Then there's four, so those quotes are from today's naturalists, or going back, it's not limited to Golden Age. Then there are 14 photos that are limited to parks, wildlife refuges that were established during the 20 years of the Golden Age. Secondly, getting a little heavier, it's an interesting science concept. Edward O. Wilson, longtime chair of biology, PhD, one of the greatest naturalists of the last 40 years, unfortunately just died about a year or two ago. And he has a great way of writing, but he was the father of biodiversity, for instance, very strong island technology with, he wrote a book just on ants. I read it, and it actually reads pretty good. But he has a book his book on My Naturalist Life or Naturalist is very, very good. And here's a 5-year-old in Mobile, Alabama, can't see very well, and his parents are breaking up and all sorts of things. It's a tough life. And he sees these ants by the dock. They're different than the other ants. Mm-hmm. And they're calling the ships, because Mobile was a pretty big commercial port. Mm-hmm. And he starts to see it, he starts to study, and here he goes, and then he goes to Harvard and all this. So he wrote a whole book on biophilia, and I just mentioned one thing that's interesting. Here you have one of the top scientists in the world, naturalist, and he says every person has, to some degree, somewhere inside of them, there's a connection to nature.
Of course.
And it's interesting that he says that, and that technically is the translation of biophilia. It goes back, he didn't invent the word, it's kind of a Latin word, but he certainly promoted it more than anything else. So, want to think from a science standpoint, but also when you look at nature conservation, it can be a different way that you live your life. And one of the great, I really love, it's called the Moth Snowstorm, and one of the great followers of environmental policy. He wrote for the London Times. He was mainly a reporter on the policy matters of science and biology, but he wrote this book just 4 or 5 years ago, and it's the Moth Snowstorm. So he was talking about it as a kid when they were driving around near Liverpool where he grew up. The moths would be so thick, it looked like a snowstorm. So he calls it the Moth Snowstorm, nature door. So he has this great quote, and I think I have it in the book, I can't remember if it's 32, but it's a great quote. So as a 14-year-old, he would leave his kind of a tough family life, but he would walk through the backyard, just a little down the hill to the Dee estuary, where the Dee River, south of Liverpool, comes into the Irish Sea. And he became fascinated with the birds and the sea and everything there. So he said, when I was there in the Dee estuary, I saw the world like I never saw it before. So he starts to see the world in a different way, a different lens. Or I may have seen it from a different part of me. So sometimes there's parts of us that come up later in life or at different times in life that we never knew was part of us. Or what can be like Muir and Roosevelt in this golden age, we can see things differently.
So now let's talk about that for a moment. Let's talk about seeing things differently, because you have written books on hockey. Hockey, yes, and you now live in Eden Prairie. So with your lovely wife. So you thank your mother and father for inspiring you to work for nature conservation. So what initially drew you to focus on Muir and Roosevelt, who formed this strong bond over their mutual love of nature?
Well, it gets back to the story, as I said before. But the foundation of what got me connected was things that, yes, my mom and dad and my family doing a lot of camping, a lot of hiking, a lot of visiting, and a lot of connections with nature. The hockey part, very passionate people, and these two were extremely passionate from practically when the youngest childhood in Dunbar, Scotland for Muir, along the coastline there, just down from their house, till 11. Then he moves to Portage, Wisconsin, or Lake Fountain, right about where the Fox River and Wisconsin River, in a modest farm there. And then you have a sickly child, Roosevelt, so he's not running up and down looking at nature because he couldn't leave the 5-story, very rich brownstone, but he had books, adventure books of nature. And later on, not that much later, he reads The Origin of Species, Darwin. He's reading Audubon's Birds of America, and he's studying it, and he's focused. So that passion from hockey goes to these two.
Wonderful. So I really wanted to know how that left turn with hockey came along, so I appreciate that.
It's not left turn, it's straight down.
So in this book now, getting back to the Kindred Spirits, so you highlight, and you just talked about their very different backgrounds, their contrasting personalities and approaches of Roosevelt and Muir. Can you expand on their differing philosophies? So Roosevelt being the more pragmatic, political approach versus Muir's more spiritual and idealistic connection to nature, and how that shapes their work on land preservation.
Their differences are so strong and their similarities are so strong, and it's a very good point. You bring up some really good meaty discussion even beyond this of working together or respecting and giving a lot of support for people that are different. You could start with wealth. Here you have the second, third richest family in the United States in New York City. His grandfather was in some article number 3, Roosevelt. And you're living on East 20th Street in the heart of Manhattan. And this is going to be the greatest naturalist conservationist in America. And then you have a fairly modest farm. I'm not going to say it's poor because they own their own home and they had but modest. So you have those big differences of wealth. Then you have family background. One's an immigrant at age 11, the other 8 generations in Manhattan. I don't even know, is there 8 people that all lived in Houston or Minnetonka? All in Manhattan, 6 before President Washington, 2 later. Then you have, health. Well, support of the father and parents.
Right.
Roosevelt's father was just loving. He'd read stories to him. He'd have prayer services. He'd take him as an asthmatic, sickly child in his arms, walking, horseback riding. Muir's father beat him every day after work on the farm, age 12 in Wisconsin through age 18. But they have great similarities of this focus and passion for. So one of the things we talked a little bit about And one big difference is there probably was no big game hunter. And as a kid hunting, shooting birds, then Muir. And we can get off on a discussion of, can you be a hunter and also be a great naturalist, or are you a preservationist, or are you a specimen naturalist? And we can all talk about that. But Muir never owned a gun, never hunted. So that would be an interesting thing. Today we'd say, oh, you're bad and you're good, so I'm going with the good person, not the bad person, and we can't do things together. Or we can't support each other, or we can't have goals, and we can't have objectives that we're accomplishing these things together. And that might be an interesting example of, well, you're a hunter, no, I can't do anything with you. Or you're
Right, these polar opposites worked together, and is there a paragraph that you would like to share right now about their work together and what they were able to do regarding the conservation in the United States?
Well, I have a couple readings from the book, so you hear a little bit about the book. I see that Edge of the Sea, Rachel Carson, right there, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Well, one of the big John Muir quotes, and it's from his book, The Yosemite, is everyone needs beauty as well as bread. So needs a park as well as bread too. Everyone needs beauty as well as bread, a place to play in, a place to pray in, where nature can heal and give strength to broken bodies and broken souls alike. So that's kind of his words, his way to do it. But that's one of the quotes from the book, but the other part is to have, there's two of the landmark old or beginning parts to environmentalism, nature conservation, some call it the land ethic. One is from Muir, one is from Aldo Leopold from Sand County. So the one from Aldo Leopold, Sand County Almanac, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So those are two from the book.
Now, I want to talk about what you had mentioned in talking about Yosemite, but you just mentioned Yosemite. Mm-hmm. So again, as we all know, Teddy Roosevelt meets John Muir, and in 1903 they go on this camping trip in Yosemite, and that serves as a turning point in their relationship. And in what ways did it directly influence Roosevelt's policies on conservation? Because they never really collaborated and worked side by side in planning and doing everything, but how did that influence his policies on conservation from that point forward?
I'm going to read from part of the book that really sums it up from Douglas Brinkley. Doug Brinkley is a presidential historian, but he's written on a lot of environmentalists. So his really a fantastic book called Wilderness Warrior, and it's from 1999. But I show this on the map because when they met was May 15th, when Muir and Roosevelt met. So we're talking about these 20 years, 1889. This is not till the 14th year of these 20 years. And there's been all sorts of national parks, national forests, wildlife refuges, things that have been established before then. And here they first meet. They correspond a little bit before then to get ready for this meeting. But there was this train trip, 66 days. Mm-hmm. Roosevelt gets on a special train, goes to Chicago, goes here, and then he passes right over here to Wayzata. Goes right through Wayzata on the line, going down. Well, they actually drop down in South Dakota, then they go across. So they stop in Yellowstone, and they spend a week there. John Burroughs is with him, and at that time was the top naturalist in the United States, mainly known for, Wake Robin, one of his big books. He wrote about 22 books. But they had done a lot together, so they camped for that 1 week, but otherwise he'd have 6 speeches, 10 speeches, 12 speeches a day at all these stops with the train. Then they had that 1 week in Yellowstone. Then he got sailed. So he had never been to see the Pacific Ocean. He'd never been to Grand Canyon. He'd never been to Yosemite. And he loved Yellowstone though, and that's what got many of his things going. And he brought his family there a number of times, and he thought Yellowstone was the greatest park in the world. Then he sees the Grand Canyon, like, oh, geez, this is part of America. Unbelievable. So he makes a lot of speeches. At first he had some policy things about the world and politics and the international, but then it's stronger and stronger messages directly to the American people. But understand he was extremely well known by almost all Americans, as was Muir. As Muir started writing these articles as the Mountain Man and then started publishing books. So both of them, as a similarity, very well known. So I'm going to dispute a little bit of what was in the question by our moderator, because there is, in many children's books, and over the years, there's kind of a folk legend, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, that, oh, when they met, because when they met at Yosemite, it was a very interesting thing. They had the 3 days, and all the president's people with him were not to go with him, and they went on this 3 days and 3 nights, and Yosemite has 16, it's an incredible park, more than 14,000 feet. You've got this great Yosemite Falls, the largest waterfall in the United States. I think it's number 3 overall. That Angel Falls is, and it's large, just incredible. But the 2 of them, go on this 3-day camping trip, hiking trip, and they have 2 guides that are naturalists in the park and 1 packer. So just the 5 of them. And May 15th through 17th, they're going through this one field. Here you are in May in California. It was snowing. It was up to past their knees. They just talked. They had a great trip. But there's this legend, folk legend, that it is myth and it's false, that, Roosevelt came and he met the great mountain man, the great father of national parks, Muir, and Muir converted him and taught him all about nature conservation, all about birds and nature. And then he went out and did all these things. So not only all the, I'll read you just a little bit. As a story of many children's books recently and over the years, part of a folk cultural legend or folk mythology that this trip, the Grand Loop Tour is called, and this Roosevelt meeting with John Muir, the mountain man, the national parks man, the father of national parks, the environment man at Yosemite National Park, and this meeting Muir was a nature revelation for Roosevelt and was the cause of Roosevelt to take up nature actions. This story is that Muir, taking Roosevelt up into the Sierra Nevada mountains, hiking and camping in Yosemite, converts Roosevelt to nature and to nature conservation, teaching him about trees and wildlife, converting him to conservation thoughts and principles, and persuading him to establish parks and wildlife refuges, national forests. This story is false on all levels. Yet the story is one way this trip is given importance in nature and environmental history by parts of American culture. So recently, this story that this trip was a substantial change in Roosevelt is a story or emphasis of a book. It's not really, it sounds a little bit like a kid's book, but it's kind of what I'd call a popular trade book. Mm-hmm. It's called Teddy Roosevelt in California, the Whistle Stop Tour that changed America. See again. And it's by Chris Epting in 2015, so it's not that long ago. Now
I have that book.
Well, yeah. So I say this story disregards the depth of Roosevelt's nature knowledge, his writing, his advocacy, and huge nature conservation accomplishments, as if he had no nature knowledge at all before the Muir meeting, as if he was not a naturalist and not one of the top naturalists in the world, as if he'd not be one of the top ornithologists and not one of the top naturalist writers, if he'd not established millions of acres of nature conservation and nature forests. And he had just started, before he got on that train and ended up meeting Muir, he had established the first national wildlife refuge, Pelican Island, on the east coast north of Fort Lauderdale and Miami by the Indian River. And of course, we'll take a look at, right now might be a good time to just look at this slide. So I kept telling you about those years, 20 years. So if we look at basic things before the 20 years age and after. So let's look, I was just telling you about wildlife refuges and how he started the first one, and when it ends, there's 51. There was 2 national parks, technically kind of one, Yellowstone, but Mackinac Island was a national park first and it went back to state. So went from 2 to 18. National monuments, Roosevelt started that, there was 0, 16. So you think of the country, 1789, finally after the Revolutionary War starts, goes 70 some years. You have Yellowstone. Then 18 years later, 17 years later, 1889, Muir has with the Sierra Club these first three that are all there. Sierra Sequoia, General Grant, they called it then, and Yosemite. But you could see national forests, it's better to look at the measure of acres, but still 25 to 175. So not only is this an incredible, as I said at the beginning, there's been no 20 years since then that has had such a huge monumental, and then we're starting with basically zero to this. But the best way of describing this, Douglas Brinkley, noted historian, brilliantly sets forth the nature conservation and nature preservation background of Roosevelt before this trip and before meeting Muir and the staffs as the nation's top nature conservation leader. And I say it's contrary to that Epting book. But he says the Great Loop Tour, in the opinion, nature and value of this trip was that the Great Loop trip or journey convinced Roosevelt not only that his conservation agenda was on track in the West, but that it needed to be amplified. So not just the meeting, they loved each other, they talked into the night, they compared notes, and yes, when you think of the two, Muir was much more from his interest and his great passion and knowledge with trees, mountains, rivers, and animals, birds, was much more Roosevelt, although they both had great university education background in botany and all sorts of zoology. So he says that Roosevelt, the strong force, so he says needed to be, the great was track on the West, but it needed to be amplified for the ages, and his friendships with Muir, first time, Burroughs that I mentioned, Finley was from Portland, and he also met during this trip before he'd never met. So, quote, it needed to be amplified, end quote, is a strong force from the trip. Brinkley's words that Roosevelt turned conservation into a universalist endeavor are huge, signifying a paradigm shift culturally, society, somewhat what we're talking about. Society shifted nature conservation now at the table, a foothold, part of many discussions, a transformation, turn a powerful word. So, before, there wasn't any nature conservation. And then when I talk about universal, now has a place at the table. I'm not saying it wins all the time. It might be 1 for 25, but at least it lost being at the table, at least now part of the discussion. All right.
So this really just confirmed this meeting and this camping trip to President Roosevelt, that what he was doing was justified, and it gave him it just validated what he was already wanting to do.
That and more, that I need to do more because I've seen all these things and they need to be preserved. And then you could see, and I put in the book the words from his speeches, because he gave really speeches at different, and of course the one at Grand Canyon is very well known, but he's basically telling people now, and he's a huge popular cultural figure because he was known as kind of the ranch man, he had all that stuff from Badlands, and then it becomes that the Rough Riders, the military hero as the Rough Rider colonel, so then he becomes Colonel Roosevelt, and he's very, very popular. Yeah. So people would come to hear him that knew nothing about nature conservation, and he'd tell them, hey, you have to change. Before you ripped up all the land, and now these things are extinct, and we need to conserve them. We need to conserve them for your use, but for your children. Right. And he started to speak to them directly with that.
So you just brought that up, how people saw him as the Rough Rider and political and bully and this and that, and he was also an avid hunter.
Yep.
Now John Muir, on the other hand, was more spiritual and he was against hunting, and like I had mentioned before, these men were viewed as polar opposites. And in today's world, we can look back and see that these men respected each other. How can we take that and away with us when interacting with people who are very different from us and have very different views in our lives today?
You said it. It's a lesson by itself. The lesson's there. It's a great example of here's common objectives, common goals we have. People have all sorts of parts to them. It's not just always a black or white, and let's work on the things we have together. Yeah, when I said big time hunter, he had huge well, but one thing that strong similarity is they both had university education, University of Wisconsin with Muir just living 40 miles north of University of Wisconsin in Portage. He didn't get his degree, but he had the 4 years. He took all the biology classes, and then he used science because he had a whole new glacier theory that got accepted of Sierra Nevada. And Roosevelt, the same at Harvard. He was going to be a naturalist. He shifted gears when his dad died at his second year in college, but he had all that background, and he continued to follow the sciences. So they both had that, which fueled their interest, but also the details of how great they were with it. But they had these differences that didn't sit in the way at all. It went forward. But one, I was going to mention another part of their records of accomplishment is that they had the passion was just there from day one, and they didn't follow a conventional straight line that we may say, oh, if somebody's going to be a leader of nature conservation, they would be maybe the chair of some university department, then maybe they'd run a park, then maybe they'd run a region, and then they would have some legislation. And you may say, well, wasn't Muir always in the Yosemite Valley? It wasn't just a recluse? No, he got married, he had 2 young daughters, and he ran an orchard of 2,500 acres just outside San Francisco. So he's going back and forth some 150 miles to Yosemite during those 10 years. Roosevelt, you can't, I mean, he has 10 years where he's the U.S. Civil Service Commission in Washington, D.C. Boy, that really makes you think of nature, huh? And then he's the commissioner with 2 or 3, there's 3 commissioners, the New York City Police Department. So he's doing all sorts of things, and there's for 2. Then he goes back to Washington, D.C., and he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Well, none of that would be your conventional. So the lesson, to get back, is a lot with what I was saying about how it's improbable that this happened at this time, at this place, in all these circumstances, but also improbable that these are the 2 leaders, just because it's not conventional. It could have easily been, 10 other figures that you would think. And here are those 10 years, Roosevelt's doing all these other things, but whenever he had a chance, he'd run off to do a hike or go to not to look at birds, or when he was at Harvard, he'd run off to Maine in the woods, kind of like the Boundary Waters type of thing they had there. And he'd run to Yellowstone, or he'd run to Badlands. And so they had this passion, but very improbable is another lesson. So another lesson, I kind of referred to it before, that we sometimes say, well, I'm busy now, I'll get on the board, I'll do that volunteer work with that nature conservation, maybe in 5 years or 10 years. They did it from day one to, or I was on boards with a lot of groups, and people serve their term for 3 years or 6 years, then they get off the board. Right. Well, when Sierra Club was founded by Robert Underwood Johnson and Muir in San Francisco at Yosemite, they have those 3 national parks right away. Yeah. So he finds the founder, and he is the president until he dies, some 22 years later. So this was, and the same Boone and Crockett, we were talking about big time hunter, this was the outfit that still does the measurements for various game. And of course, what's Crockett? Davy Crockett. What's Boone? Right. So that was all rich people that are big game hunters in New York City. He founds it with the Forest and Stream magazine, George Grinwell. They found it together, but he is the president of that group until he becomes vice president of the United States. He ought to set aside what he's doing that. So for 15 years, that's it. Well, how did that evolve then? Well, he always doing things, but they wanted to preserve nature at Yellowstone and around it for hunting. Mm-hmm. And that began all this regulations of nature preservation, and then hugely meet with President Benjamin Harrison in Washington to have new national forests like we saw there. So that began the whole thing. But you can see very different ways to go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to do another reading on this?
Yeah. Second is the other land ethic, but this time it's the one from Muir. and you've heard this before, it'll come back to you, but pretty simple. So Muir's writing, and this is from his book, My First Summer in the Sierras, when he was helping the sheep ranchers, and he hated those sheep. He called them the locusts of the wilderness because they were wrecking everything that had to do with natural writing. So Muir says, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it is hitched to everything else in the universe. Now, hitch is somewhat of a unknown term these days, or not very well used these days. Then I wanted to, I just mentioned these advocacy. So I think the other reading, so that's a quote that's one of these 32 quotes through the book. So with that this is description, and I had a little bit mentioned this before, from chapter 3, the life journeys of this sickly child living with his family in an East 20th Street Manhattan 5-story brownstone with 2 live-in servants and luxury all around, and of this child working long, hard physical labor on the Wisconsin farm, receiving almost daily beatings at the hands of his father. Both had changes of course in their journeys up to the Golden Age, and changes of course of their journeys in the Golden Age. Changes of course were turning points on the path or the journey that changed their lives from the course they were proceeding on to turns that brought them together with other factors, turning points to a different place, a place that transformed America. I'll mention we can reflect on our own life with different changes as we're a journey of different things we do. There's a great book, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book, Outliers, a story of success. And he had a lot of factors there, but there was description of Gates with the computers, a concert pianist, people that have had incredible success. But he talks about there's a lot of genius, but a number of things. The 10,000 hour rule, he has that. You have to have, and Gates is a 7th grader in computer club. He's going to University of Washington also. But he also said there's a lot of factors that have to come together, like these turning points, to get you, and that's certainly here. We hear in Muir, when he left the University of Wisconsin, he also was really inventive with industrial engineering things. And he was working a little bit in Canada and in Indianapolis, so that's when he had his eye injury from a piece of work he was doing, and that's when he took the 1,000-mile walk and wrote about it. And so on the journey is different, the factors come together.
The title of the book deals with nature conservation, and you had talked about how the land heals us. So I've got a twofold question, and this goes now to environmentalism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we talked about conservation, but with environmentalism, we oftentimes think of Rachel Carson. She has written several books, including the 1962 book, of course, Silent Spring, which exposed the hazards of DDT. How was she influenced by these two great people, Roosevelt and Muir's movement, this movement that spurred on nature conservation? How did that influence her with her environmentalism?
Well, this great bookstore, The Thinking Tree, we've got one of her great books, The Edge of the Sea. So people don't realize sometimes that she had 4 naturalist books before she wrote Silent Spring. Mm-hmm. And one of them wasn't published till after she died. Unfortunately, she died just a year or 2 after writing Silent Spring. But to answer your question, it's really, really good. Everyone after this golden age benefited or stood on the shoulders or had a foundation of nature conservation. It is very picky and small to even find those words used. Marsh, this author, Man in Nature, he used it. Thoreau, everything you read, Thoreau, we know him today, we've got all the posters the last 50 years, but the amount of popularity or his writings known to the general public was very, very limited. The number of copies of his books, even 20, 30 years after they were written, it's very, very low. So great principles, but I don't think anybody was paying attention or knew much about it. So Susan Fenimore Cooper, Rural Hours, she had some really strong nature but the actual principles in action that people see. Well, there's a park, there's a wildlife refuge. Oh, maybe we shouldn't make everything extinct. Or the millinery business, we're slaughtering flamingos, brown pelicans like crazy. Maybe, so you see it in action, then you have such strong figures as these two, that from then it makes it much easier. But the characteristics of Rachel Carson is a great example, because she had that science background. Now she had stayed with the science, and she had a master's aquatic biology, and she's working for at that time it was called U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, Fish and Wildlife. And then when she began writing more and more, she stopped to just continue writing. So she was a writer, just like both Muir and Roosevelt. Strong science background, incredible university and master's degree, just like Muir and Roosevelt. And then I call it field observation was a big part of her memoirs, a lot like both of them, but especially Roosevelt wanted the whole idea of biology and anatomy or botany to have much more in the field. And then this Silent Spring. And I think we ought to, she has some great quotes in Silent Spring about nature and connected to nature, but of course the one we know the strongest is no witchcraft, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in this stricken world. The people had done it themselves. And of course the whole idea is that the spring of new life and renewal was the DDT stopped. So she very strong, and as you say, started the what I call the modern environmental movement.
Right. So she really took up this what Muir and Roosevelt had strongly encouraged and pushed with the preserving of nature. She then took up the mantle, but also in the framework more about addressing the environmental challenges.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and like your thoughts, people when they think of parks or wildlife refuges, birds, they might not think of pollution or environmental. But when Roosevelt first saw Grand Canyon, and then he was trying to get it, the mining were grabbing it, mineral rights like crazy, some ranching, and he couldn't get it as a park, so of course he ISO declare it, he got a national monument, and 10 years later he made a park. But that's an example that people think, oh, that's a park, Grand Canyon, beautiful to see, but what does that have to do with? Well, if it wasn't a park, it was going to be mined, and there's tailings, and it affect the Colorado River, and all the.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. So I've got one more question.
Are we going to ask the audience what parks have been?
Absolutely. Let's do that.
Go ahead, do it.
So when we think of national parks, there are several games. I see several games in the store, and I know there are several national park games. Anybody played any of those before? There's some really good ones out there. I've seen actually some that have been advertised on Instagram that you can get. There's certain games out there now that you can visit certain things even within your state. Card games that you can visit, do and interact with and play based on your state and the parks within your state. It's super cool. Yeah.
So what parks have you been to, or wildlife?
God lives in Grand Canyon in my
Grand Canyon, right? Yeah.
But I've been, to New Mexico, mainly the Southwest.
Texas, been a Big Bend.
Yeah,
Big Bend at the...
but from Florida, I've done the entire, and up to DC. I've gotten to.
So when you
there's
think
a lot
of
of travel in Montana,
the Grand Canyon is so huge, 1 million acres,
I'm telling
and
you,
the river
God,
is
if you
25,
don't
30
find
miles.
yeah.
The whole river, and this Pelican Island. Roosevelt loved. The brown pelican was that first wildlife refuge, and we've talked about where it is. It's only 2-3 acres, 4 acres at the most. A couple of these really small. So you go from 2-3 acres to 1 million acres, and here's the Yosemite. So this would be the Muir. But Roosevelt, when he made these wildlife refuges, yes, a lot of them are in and around. Here's the Gulf with Breton near west of New Orleans, Louisiana, and of course Florida. But he also had the migratory as to where they go. So Huron Island, that's at Lake Superior off Wisconsin, or actually UP at that point, was made during the Golden Age. And then here's this huge, anybody familiar with North Dakota, and a little bit west of Jamestown, just outside Jamestown. And again, it's where the pelicans where they migrate to. So he established down in Florida, then he established in North Dakota, and then now this is another example. It's before Roosevelt was president, and this is a Muir one. It's a Muir in the Sierra Club. Mount Rainier, everybody knows it near Seattle, but it was not something they did together, but they were supporting each other separately, but before he became president too. All right.
I just want to say, one of the things less attractive are the flight of the bats. I mean, they have them out of Houston now to Mexico, but New Mexico, that's not as pretty.
No.
But
well, Lucy
phenomenal.
Peabody was, what Roosevelt had would be, there's many people in this chapter that talks about the 17 naturalists. There was 5 or 6 people that had one particular project, and they would do all the work on it. And of course, Roosevelt was in favor of this. Steele with Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. Lucy Peabody was Mesa Verde, so the cliff dwellings in southern Colorado with that. So you had examples of that. Where have you been? What parks?
Thinking of Joshua Tree.
Oh,
Wow. That's lovely.
Yes.
Did you go to Death Valley when you were there?
Death Valley.
All right, you've been below sea level.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whole different look with the Death Valley, the desert and the mountains.
Yes, but a beauty that, for me, you didn't find here in Minnesota. I love Minnesota, but that landscape of Death Valley, the wide spaces, just and the changes within Death Valley. They had floods this past year. Just beautiful place.
What about just some general questions of the audience?
Absolutely.
They're not going to be as good as Gwen's. No, anything, a question? The book is available here at the store for $19. And please, if you're not here today and you're looking at it at social media, feel free to stop by the store at any time. But there may be all sorts of questions. It's always interesting bibliography too, and we were talking about it with the gold standard English teacher here in the audience. And it's always good to look at the different books. There was a lot of, one thing that readers know, there are many, many books about Theodore Roosevelt, even just the last 5-6 years. But it's a good one. Well, I talked about the Brinkley one now 10 years ago, of course, about nature. There's one just 2-3 years ago, A Life of Letters, talking about all his writing. He wrote 52 books. 22 are nature related, 12 are hardcore nature, because the other ones are more hunting and this sort of thing. But the War of 1812, yes, that's one on. Well, he was such an. He had one on exercise. I'll look it up. But so bibliography is interesting to check out as everything there was. So I tried to read quite a few of the Muir books and the nature books for Roosevelt, but also his new Roosevelt. But they're very well. I don't know of any that holds up this golden age, this 20 years, and I don't know any that compares the two. And I had some other. Gwen and I were talking about this. Sue Leaf, that's a huge nature conservationist, wrote on the bird ornithologist Thomas Sadler Roberts, the Minnesota, the love affair with birds. She wrote on the geologist, and she's the president of Audubon Club, and just had a new book come out, Impermanence, about the South Shore of Lake Superior. But she has a good memory. So she said, "What is this? These two together? Nobody's ever put these two together. This guy Mountain Man over here and Bully Pulpit or Bully. What's going on?" So she had some fun trying to know what's going on.
I was, while you were talking, I was thinking of Sigrid Olson and Jacques, and the relationship there, and also along with Aldo Leopold. Was he part of that, of Sigrid Olson, or was that a different time? Aldo Leopold.
Yeah, the time period, what's great at connecting here is, obviously he comes later, but when he first worked in, coming out of college, he worked at a ranger tower at Santa Fe National Forest, which was one of the forests established by the Golden Age. But Leopold, longtime University of Wisconsin professor, and then he was with the Institute of Forest Products Research, but he was a professor in the forestry at Wisconsin. Of course, Santa County Almanac, right above there. So where was Muir? University of Wisconsin, so he had that connection. Sigurd Olson had gone to Northland College of Connection in Superior, Wisconsin, but he was teaching a little bit, not quite the conventional path maybe, and started writing when it was at the, I think they call it the Tasca Community College, not Tasca, what am I saying, Community College in Ely. And then he became the dean, and then he started writing more. But yeah, the top, we were talking earlier, naturalist writers, this Terry Tempest Williams, that was a naturalist at the museum in Salt Lake City, great memoir, Refuge, and she has come on very, very good as a naturalist writer, and now much more with philosophy and climate change. Barry Lopez, well, go back a few, Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek won the Pulitzer Prize, but Sigurd Olson is certainly up there with Aldo Leopold. As far as the time periods, yeah, they overlap, but they were never, as far as I know, had any work directly. Now, the Wilderness Society, and then later the Boundary Waters, although Ernie Oberholzer was more the full force behind the Boundary Waters, but he did have a position, Sigurd Olson, I think he was executive director for 4 or 5 years with the Wilderness Society, and then he was a long time on the board. So they had advocacy groups. So, and some writers have no advocacy groups, some have a lot of advocacy, but those were great writers.
I wanted to come back one more time to our stars of the show here, Roosevelt and Muir.
Okay.
And now looking at it more from the critics, because everybody has their critics, right? So when it came to their conservation efforts, how did their relationship withstand some of the political and public pressures that they faced, especially considering not all Americans were on board with this, right? You mentioned the mining companies and so on and so forth, that they were not in favor of such extensive land protection. So how did their relationship withstand that, or how did they react to those critics? If you could be so kind and address that.
It goes back to that discussion about improbable leaders, improbable time. They simply onward focused. It didn't, critics more, he was so forceful and so energy, and actually more and more I learned about Muir, because you think of not being involved with so much of the advocacy or finance groups, but he started the Sierra Club. A lot of the main funding was from some fairly rich donors from San Francisco. He had a trip with Gifford to New York City. He met Roosevelt, this is after the 1900s, and then he actually toured Europe, then they're big travels, big adventures. So back to your point is, it didn't really bother them at all, these factors, these other things. They just kept plowing ahead. The other thing that's really interesting from adventure, going out in nature, they did more than just that. They were really adventure hikers. Roosevelt, Muir climbed a couple of mountains. He was the first person to sky Mount Whitney, Mount Rainier. Roosevelt, the Matterhorn twice. He had the, what's it called, Catoctin in Maine. And then when McKinley was shot, he was hiking Mount Marcy. It's the highest mountain in New York with his family. So he's and then, well, Muir had a 1,000-mile walk to Gulf of Mexico, but he went hiked down the Wisconsin River. He had a lot of trail. They were always hiking. Always. When he lived in the Badlands, he went on a hunting thing for 3 months into northern Wyoming and came back and just.
So they just stayed the course, and oil and water just.
That's
kept
right.
on.
And I think part of that was they became such nationally known characters of popular culture and popular in levels that they'd never seen before. This Colonel Roosevelt, Rough Rider, and Ranchman, and that's what connected so much to common people. But yeah, there's a lot of, I suppose you could say, if you want to be real crass about it, his simply I so declare it and doing so much that he could sign on as president without anything going past him. That is kind of, use whatever you want to use. But yeah, they weren't happy with the mining and they weren't happy with the ranch because he was able to do it by that alone. But he tried to have it at least make a number of attempts to get through. But if they weren't buying it, he was going ahead, and that's one way he went ahead, was to I so declared, I sign off. Because the when you look at these, I mean, I hate to be politically crass about it, but those four, the only one that needs legislative action is the national parks. Now, some of these, like wildlife refuges, many times that's already federal land. So you're not condemning land, you're not doing a eminent domain, but you're taking land and now conserving it, taking away maybe mineral rights, that just like there's logging rights and mineral rights on national forests.
Right.
But he just went ahead.
Well, I so declare that it has been a pleasure interviewing you and asking you questions.
Well, we had the A-team here today.
So, and thank you so much for
Great,
your time
thank
and
you.
today and the lovely
Thank you
book
all for
and
coming.
experience.
Thank you very much. Okay.
So one thing I did want to ask, so we recently read a book about Alexander von Humboldt, and did you, and it seems like he was sort of the ultimate, the first naturalist and preservation and conservation person, and influenced a lot of people, according to Darwin, Thoreau, Gray, George Perkins Marsh, and Muir. Like he read his books and he like underlined, and he read his books about him and of him and of. So have you come across like his influence on Muir?
Say the name again. I didn't.
Alexander von Humboldt.
Oh yeah, Humboldt. I have.
Because he apparently at one point he was very popular. Lots of roads, even in the U.S., he was very popular. Roads named after him, monuments named, buildings, Humboldt Avenue here.
Humboldt
And
High
then
School.
just
Yeah.
feels like this day and age, nobody's heard of him. Nobody knows about him, but he influenced so many people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
the
I'm
early,
curious in your research, did you come across that?
I should pull out my notes from the naturalist writers. The ornithologists before Audubon that had quite a bit of a documentary right. Then Humboldt is mentioned as goes into the time periods. Well, when we talk about Thoreau, there's this transcendental meditation group, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and that always should be mentioned when you talk about naturalist writers, but they had their own group. And we mentioning Muir, you have to, well, one of the 7 turning points, yes, we talked about when he had the eye injury, but when towards the end of his being a student at the University of Wisconsin, had a great teacher, this Davis Butler, he took his class in Latin, but the big thing was he pulled Muir aside and gave him Ralph Waldo Emerson's book, number 1, that he kept with him when he'd hike every day, read it all the time. And second, he told him, you should start putting your thoughts down and putting your field notes and your observations down and start writing yourself. So he took those 2 things to heart, and that really influenced him a lot, even though he had this kind of industrial engineering thing. And then actually Butler came out to Yosemite and he showed around for one of the times at Yosemite. But those early of Audubon and this other, and then as the different writers that have a little bit of nature conservation in the beginning parts, and it would be really interesting how that threads through and how it connects.
Yeah, this book called Invention of Nature is,
Yeah,
fabulous.
that's
it
right.
talks
Yep.
through.
I'm gonna have to do some
Yep,
research.
Yeah,
Invention.
that is a really good
Yeah,
book.
it's-
It has the
That
thread
is a
through all the way
great,
through.
thank you.
That's good to know.
That's fantastic.
I have a question. So your slides about before and after,
Yeah.
The national parks.
Yeah.
And, have they changed? Do we have more now?
Well, it's been more since 1909,
Yeah.
but there's never been a 20-year period that
Yeah.
has much
That
happened on
much.
that. There, in the book, there was not that long ago, that looked at each president and their use of national monuments. Gets a little skewed if you just go by the national monument numbers, because if it lists acreage, for instance,
Yeah.
because George W. Bush had quite a bit in the Pacific, but it was, of course, huge amounts of area, or Alaska area rather than the actual national lines. But it was a good, and then some presidents had 0, so he had that, but it was a good listing because it lists everybody, including Roosevelt, on. And there's 67 national parks now, and you know, before there was 12, so there's been great growth. But we're, since 1909, what is it now, 120, exactly 125 years to 2024. So in that time period, we had at least 5 20-year periods, and there's never been a growth like that at all. And there's a little bit of, you know, if you want to get technical here, I mentioned Grand Canyon. So there's a little bit of 2 or 3 that were first a national monument that became a national park during that time. So Exhibit A would be Grand Canyon.
Is the national monument the first designation?
No,
Or
it's
a
separate by
national
itself.
Yeah.
Separate by itself. Oh, but
And then it becomes a national park?
no,
Not necessarily.
separate by itself.
It's just
So
by itself.
Devil's Tower, you know, just into Wyoming from
Yeah.
South Dakota.
Yeah.
Some of the
But what didn't,
there are a couple that happened, but it was simply, see, a national monument can be just by the president by himself,
right,
but it has to fit into this Antiquities Act. So it was a little strange to me, and go ahead and tell me what your
well, I
thoughts
was
are
just
too.
saying that Theodore Roosevelt made a national monument, and then you go back and you can then take the land around it and make it a national park.
But you have to have the legislation passed
Right.
to make it a national park. But this Antiquities Act, Lacey, who was a U.S. representative from Iowa, and there's a few things named after him, and he was the one legislator that actually worked on a number of things, where others it would be what's in their district, or you know, to a very limited. And it kind of surprised me. It got 20 years. Well, who did Roosevelt work with? Okay, maybe there wasn't everybody was in favor of all this, but there must have been 4 or 5 in the House of Representatives, maybe 4 or 5 senators. And Lacey, there might have been a few, but I'm kind of asking what you think. There really is the only one that is referred to as Lacey. There were a number that were involved in one project or 2 projects.
Right.
And it was, the other thing that's very interesting during this time period is a lot of this is way too little, you're not going to be able to read it. Yeah, here's U.S. Representative John F. Lacey sponsored key Roosevelt legislation, the last act, and then see that Antiquities Act in 1906, so that was national monument. So before then, you could never have a national monument. And then after Roosevelt, so that time, presidents served until like March 10th or March 15th. So Roosevelt is still signing these national monuments 2 days before his last day to get these 51 wildlife refuges in. But the other thing, when you talk about big time hunter, I'm just throwing this in as a little interest. So when he left the White House in March of 1909, his last day, he goes on almost a year safari in East Africa. At that time it's called British East Africa, now Tanzania. It kind of takes his one son Kermit, ends up being 11 months. And he's such a big reader. His sister really helped him a lot, was a great throughout his life, Corrine. They called Pigskin Library because she wrapped it in this pigskin. She had 39 books. He's such a voracious reader, as was Muir. But he would go hunting all day and do this, but then at campfire he'd be reading like crazy. Yeah. So he read all the books after the 5th month. He had to go to Nairobi and get another 25 books. But you talk about a big time hunter, when he leaves the White House, first thing he does is go hunt for 11 months.
Yeah. And what's so neat is in the course that I teach is that the students do research projects on national parks, but then some of my students have traveled abroad, and the national parks is an American idea, and other countries have now taken this idea, of course, and expanded on it. And so they wanted to do research on national parks outside of the United States, because this is on their bucket list, and then they wanted to travel there. And so we do research on national parks outside of the United States, and it's amazing how many countries have taken this idea and used it to save and preserve land in their countries.
in very simple terms, could you explain those 4 terms?
Uh,
Monument, refugee, national park.
Yes, I was actually going to address that. There are different
the
rules.
wildlife refuge, first it was called a bird reserve or reservation.
Yeah.
But this is the term that it's been used for quite a while now. So the first one, as we talked about, was at Pelican Island, March 3rd, 1903, just before he gets on the train 3 weeks later. There are all over the place now. That has grown quite a bit, but I don't think it's too much. National Monuments, that Antiquities Act, you have to show, and I could read the 4 or 5 characteristics, but there has to be a cultural, historical component of it.
Correct.
If it's simply a wild prairie or wild woodlands, it's not going to fit.
Mhm.
So usually, that Mesa Verde, for instance, with Lucy Peabody, there was discussion, but she got all the support and got it taken care of.
With the national parks, you cannot touch the land. You have to leave it as is. With the national forests, however, you can loan the land from the government, and you can go in and do logging and
Oh.
But it's monitored.
It's monitored.
By
okay,
contract.
okay. So that you don't.
correct.
You might have a 2-year logging contract.
Now, if you
Oh,
wanna get
Mineral,
into that.
also mineral
Mineral
rights. to
rights as
certain-
well. Mineral rights
And
as
ranch,
well.
ranch
Correct.
grazing.
So there, you can use the resources in there in a limited capacity from the government. And then, of course, you want to get really complicated, there's the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM lands,
And
that
they
are
do have-
oftentimes on the edge of these national parks. So if you ever really want to look at something confusing, is looking at your national parks map, plus the national forest map on top of that, and the BLM lands.
But BLM has some great, I call them parks, but the BLM sites,
Yes,
including some great camping
They
and,
do.
and hiking.
they do.
But the national
But different
forests,
rules.
some of them also, national forests have some great campgrounds. But I guess sometimes people always ask, I did a lot with state parks in Minnesota, and
Which is
they talk
another
about,
level.
Right, yeah.
what about the state forests?
Yeah.
And the campgrounds there, and what about these, now they have science and recreation areas. I say, well, the amenities you have in a
Right.
park, I call them amenities.
Yes.
There's more staff there.
Right.
There's naturals there with
Right.
naturals programs. The campsites are different levels of them, but many of them are a little bit more amenities.
Correct.
But a lot of
Not in the
people
national
enjoy
forest.
hiking in state forests or camping in addition to national forests.
Yeah, so it's really, yeah, it's a little bit, it's an excellent question, and I get into
Yeah,
that with my
should've-
students,
should've
and
identified that
that's
to start with.
fascinating,
So if you take boundary waters,
yes.
what's
Yeah,
there?
it doesn't fit in any of those 4. It's
Oh, it
so-
doesn't?
No,
They did? Oh.
no,
Yeah,
its
that's-
own separate thing.
Yes, it
So
is.
it'd be those 4
So if
plus
you
the
really wanna
Bureau.
get confused.
No, Gwen has a good point though, the Bureau of Land Management, and then there are these, I call them federal.
Mhm.
Well, actually, there's
Then there's-
national lake shores, like the
Yes.
Apostle Islands, that they're possibly gonna make that into a national park. But then there's a separate category of, I'll call it wilderness, quote unquote. They
Right.
go by their own separate
Wilderness
names.
preserves,
Right, so they have boundary waters, canoe
yeah.
area is its own separate
Right.
category.
If you want to have a good cry, you can look up all that and try to figure out all the legislation.
So, good point though, Minnesota had not had any national parks. And there are a number of states that don't have any. Iowa doesn't have any. Now,
So we
We
don't
have the
No.
Voyagers, we have the
well,
Voyagers.
now we have
National
Voyagers.
Park.
They
Yeah,
had
that's the
none.
one national park that we
Voy-
have.
But for instance, South Dakota, North Dakota, we always say, well, we talked about that wildlife refuge, talked about,
Right.
and they have the Theater Roosevelt National Park. But South
Correct.
Dakota has that cave one,
Wind
so,
Cave.
and of course Colorado and California have tons of them. But Minnesota didn't have any, then they had Voyager. They have 2 national monuments, which is the Grand Portage right at the border on the North Shore with the Grand Portage Ojibwe tribe.
Right.
And then you have Pipestone, Minnesota, almost in the very southwest corner by Blue Mountain State Park.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Then the 4th thing, national, and this is a different category again, there's also, although it fits under National Park Service, the river and recreation areas. So
Oh, yeah.
Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. John Namphenson wrote a great blurb on this book, and I had him at a couple of programs, and he for 20 years was the director of it. So that's the 72 miles from Hastings to Coon Rapids. And they have some control, they have to give their approval on certain well, you don't want to get too technical here on legal things, but if somebody is asking for a variance in a
Right.
zoning, they want to build a cliff 10-story apartment building or something,
Right.
and they have a lot of control from the shoreline of the river back, and they have some parks that they have. Well, actually, the only land is right over by Forest Line. They have where the creek is there near Minnetonka Creek, and they're looking at some things down by Crosby Lake to have a little visitor center thing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they have a.
But the legalities, and it can be it can be a quagmire.
But
Truly.
in the
It's an
Science
excellent-
Museum in St. Paul, there is the National Park Service, so National Parks has a small visitor center or
Yeah.
a gift shop. You can buy your pass there or do that. Otherwise, they have an office in Kellogg Square.
But any one of these are great for the conservation and
Yeah,
environment
it's a
and
great story.
connecting with nature.
All right, thank you, Rima.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you.
Thank you very much.